I know that you talk about codependency in relationship to narcissism and like the co-narcissist. It's a triggering topic for some people, but I think at the same time, it's important to understand where this stuff really originates and where it comes from and kind of how it manifests.
Co-narcissism and narcissism are two ends of the shame spectrum. One who's compensated by saying, I got to be better and superior. The other that says, I'm inferior. But what then happens to that is the co-narcissist now is, I need you to love me, to the narcissist. So I will enable you to never grow up, to never deal with your issues. I will take your pain away. I will please you. I will fix you just so that you love me. The narcissist and the co-narcissist both have a deep fear of abandonment. They are on their best behavior at first. They're doing what they can to meet each other's needs, but they're not getting their own needs met. Their shame is preventing them from being authentic. Their shame is preventing them from actually receiving love, and so they're not satisfied.
We'll make it out and fall in love tonight.
Welcome back, everybody. On today's podcast, our guest is Tim Fletcher. He's a pioneer in the addictions and mental health treatment profession and an expert on complex trauma. He's also the founder and president of React, as well as a counselor, a researcher, and a pastor. Tim, thank you for joining us today. We're super excited to chat with you.
My pleasure. Looking forward to it.
We came across your work through the podcast that you did with Theo Vaughn. And then I just went super deep down the rabbit hole of Tim Fletcher. And truthfully, over the course of our relationship, just to give you a little bit of a backstory, we've been together for 12 years, and a big chunk of that has been us just doing our best to kind of navigate the healing journey together, trying to unpack all of our past and all of our traumas, as well as all of the stuff that has come up over the course of our relationship. And we both agree that we have never heard anybody talk about trauma and talk about all the different aspects of it the way that you do. It is something that has just been so refreshing, also like eye-opening. I mean, it's literally, Tim, I don't know how to explain it other than just, it's really incredible the way that you speak about all of these things, because it gets right to the point. You cut through all sorts of different, I mean, it's just really amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to start off with and get a little bit of an understanding of, where did that come from? Like your ability to just speak straight towards some of these topics that truthfully are really, really challenging and really, really difficult. Like it's the stuff that people don't want to look at. It's the stuff that people are really having a hard time processing and dealing with.
Yeah, I think when I started over 20 years ago, I started in a residential treatment center, and we had about 10 clients at a time, and did group therapy, one-on-one counseling, psychoeducational classes. So I was working with clients all day long, every day, teaching or counseling or doing group therapy. And what I quickly began to realize was a couple things. Number one, most of them were coming off the streets, drugs, prison. And so a lot of them had minimal education. And so really, to be effective with them, I had to kind of put it on the lowest shelf so they could get access to the goods. And so I had to dumb it down in my mind and put it in language that they could understand. And often colloquial language was part of that. But secondly, what I saw with most of the treatment that was going on at that time is they did a lot of good work, important work, but it was very much symptoms, helping people regulate. It was the very beginning tools necessary to help people deal with trauma, but nobody was really getting to the core issues and speaking honestly and in detail about kind of, you can learn to regulate and count to 10 till you're blue in the face, but if you don't deal with shame and trauma and this underlying stuff, eventually all the counting is not going to work, because you're going to hit something where counting to 10 just isn't going to happen. And so it's like, I got to be able to put into words simply, but yet clearly and directly, the real issues for people. And what I saw when I was able to start doing that was people really welcomed it. Finally, somebody's being honest with us. Somebody's helping us understand it. But then I saw people really starting to grow and change, because now they had tools to actually change the deep issues, the real issues. And so it just really validated that this was the way to go in helping people. And it just kind of developed from that.
It's just grown from there. When you talk about complex trauma, I think it would be beneficial. We always have to remember, because we're like in this space all the time, all day, every day. We're kind of constantly working it together. We've both navigated, meaning like we've gone through therapy together. We've done a bunch of work over the course of our relationship. But we always have to remember that not everybody listening has. So if you wouldn't mind, take a moment to kind of break down what would be the difference between what you would kind of classify as just regular trauma from life that everybody kind of gets and experiences over the course of life through childhood and adulthood and everything like that, versus complex trauma.
Yeah, two ways that I would try to help people understand it. So the first is, when we think of trauma, we usually think of what I call big T trauma. And that's a horrific event that's out of the normal. And so, yeah, there is that element of trauma. And then, but there's also little T trauma. And little T trauma is what we would refer to as neglect trauma. So it's not something bad happening to you. It's something good that should have happened to you that's not happening to you. And that has just as much of a negative effect on a child as big T trauma, because when somebody's not there for you to meet your needs, to protect you, to comfort you, to validate you, to connect with you, all of a sudden you feel, what's wrong with me? The world's not safe. I'm all on my own. I don't belong. I don't fit in. I'm bad. All kinds of different things that have the exact same messages that come out of big T trauma. So that's the initial distinction, is kind of, when we talk about trauma, it's big T and little T trauma that has to be looked at. And what we know is that about 75% of Americans and Canadians have little T trauma, but don't even know they have it. And so it's the more common trauma, but it's the least understood and talked about trauma, because we've put so much energy into understanding big T trauma. But then the second thing is, usually when we think of trauma, we think of one-time horrific events. Complex trauma is what happens when those horrific events are happening every day and the child can't resolve it. Now that becomes complex trauma. It's ongoing, continual danger, lack of safety, because needs aren't being met or because I'm being hurt, and the child can't resolve it. And so as a result, they have to try to adapt to survive. They have to develop behaviors and ways of coping, which are all versions of fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn, as their only ways of surviving, because no healthy tools are working. And so they set up a whole coping system that keeps them safe physically as a child. But when they get to adult life, this adaptation becomes a maladaptation. It no longer is working. It's destroying relationships. It's messing up jobs. It's messing them up. And so complex trauma is adaptations to survive because of ongoing danger that become maladaptations in adult life. And the big challenge for most people is it takes 20 to 40 years before the person who made those adaptations to survive realizes that they're maladaptations, because they worked for so many years. They got them validation. They kept them safe. And they thought, wow, this is the way to go. And then 40 years later, their marriage is falling apart. Their kids hate them. All of those things are happening. And they go, what's going on here? What's wrong? And it's like this delayed consequence of 20 to 40 years before you realize the complex trauma now is coming home to roost in a very negative way.
Yeah, and we can attest to that. I mean, quite literally, we met when we were both like in our 30s.
Like barely 30.
Yeah, we were coming off of our first marriages. So our first marriages were coming to an end. We were both in law enforcement. I was a police officer and Stephanie was a dispatcher. And we had all of these kind of surface level things that we were addressing and kind of navigating. And then at some point, it was a few years into our relationship, it almost felt like the wheels just started to really come off. And since then, it has been this massive unpacking of looking at all of the complex trauma that we both had almost no awareness of to some extent, right? We each had individual examples, I guess, of stories that we could recount and experiences that we had. But it's been really eye-opening the more that we kind of have unpacked it and gone into it. And one of the things that we really wanted to kind of talk to you about, not only for our own benefit, selfishly, but we also feel like it's one of those things that is really not just common, but also not really talked about a whole lot, is the dynamic of codependency and what that actually looks like to try to unpack it in a relationship. Because that's what we've been trying to do, Tim, even just unconsciously, I think, for the last several years, and more consciously, recently, is looking at the ways that we have been codependent with one another and what that has actually really looked like and where that all kind of stemmed and started from. And I know you speak a lot about complex trauma and codependency. And so we're hoping that we can kind of get into that today to help people that might be experiencing some of these things as well.
Sure, would love to. Let me start with this and then you guys can respond to it. But when I started over 20 years ago, what I realized was there were several books that had come out. So codependency had been kind of a term for 10, 15 years by that time. But really what they were doing at that initial time was just identifying how certain relationships are different than healthy relationships. So what are the characteristics of these not so healthy relationships? And they began to identify the characteristics that became known as codependency. And so books were written and it was very helpful. It was very useful. But to me, the problem is that nobody talked about, well, where did these symptoms come from? Like, why are these people acting this way? It was almost made like they were born this way, or it was a pathology that was kind of, there's nothing you can do about it. You're screwed. That's just the way you are. And it's like, no, I can't buy that. And so what I began to realize was, to me, the most detrimental thing that comes out of complex trauma. So when a child's neglected and abused, from their vantage point as a little child, it's an egocentric way of looking at the world. Everything is about me. Everything's because of me. Everything affects me. So I'm neglected and abused because it's my fault. I must be doing something wrong. I must be bad. And so they develop a core belief of shame, which is how we describe it. So shame has been really misunderstood in our culture to be kind of you should be ashamed of yourself. But that's really guilt. Shame is actually a core belief that I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I'm not valuable, I'm less than others, I'm bad, it's my fault. And so from that, a whole bunch of dynamics begin to happen. But a person like that goes into a relationship with all the wrong priorities, with all the wrong approaches, and that ends up in codependency. So to me, complex trauma leads to shame. But then when two shame people get together, you have a codependent relationship. And so it really, to me, comes out of people, if they don't deal with the shame piece, they never really deal with the codependency piece. And so it's understanding how complex trauma creates shame, which then sets you up for relationships to fail or to be built on an unhealthy foundation.
Can you talk about some of the examples or that you've seen over the years of how, because I think there's some obvious ones that people could jump to as far as like those big T trauma moments in childhood that would contribute to somebody developing that type of feeling about themselves when it comes to shame and everything like that. But what are some of those other subtler ways that maybe that can show up in childhood? And then how does it kind of morph and change as they grow so that when they finally do get into relationships in their later years?
Yep. So I would say, to me, to begin with, a child comes into the world with really two powerful drives. So the number one is to attach. So they're totally helpless little human beings that unless they attach securely to someone, their needs aren't going to be met. So the need to connect or attach becomes a powerful, powerful drive that never disappears. It's there all of life. But the second one is a child comes in with a commitment to be fully authentic. I'm me. I'm just going to be me. And so in a healthy home, when you're fully authentic, that leads to healthy attachment. It deepens healthy attachment. It leads to intimacy. But in a complex trauma home, if I'm authentic, I get criticized. If I'm authentic, I get punished. I get authentic, I get told, don't feel that way. Don't be that way. You're too sensitive. And so what the child begins to realize is authenticity doesn't result in attachment. It results in rejection. So their brain now has been actually programmed by a lie, because it should be attachment is a result of authenticity. But in their mind, authenticity never leads to attachment. It always leads to rejection. So what do they have to do? They adapt. I still need to attach because I need my needs met. So what now will I do? I will wear masks. I will be whatever you want me to be so that you will like me. So I'll be a chameleon. I will fawn. I will be a people pleaser. I'll never say no or set boundaries because I need you to accept me so that you meet my needs and attach to me. So all of a sudden you see a whole bunch of adaptations that seem to work, but try to do that in an adult relationship where you're wearing masks, it's not going to work. It's going to lead to frustration and breakdown. And then the other thing that comes out of that is I want true connection, but I'm afraid of true connection because true connection requires being vulnerable and being authentic. But if I'm vulnerable and authentic, they're going to see the real me, which is shame that I'm not good enough, that I'm not lovable. So I need to hide the real me and wear these masks. But how do I then get connection? Well, let's just have fun. Let's just have superficial, let's everybody do stuff together, find common interests, have sports kind of camaraderie, barroom camaraderie. But that's going to be my feelings of attachment. But it's really a superficial attachment or connection feeling that doesn't really satisfy. It's kind of like a drug. I just need another fix to try to make me feel like I'm connected or I belong. And then the child has to go, okay, if I'm going to connect, not only do I have to wear masks, but I have to give up my needs and make their needs more important than my needs. So if I take care of dad and I never ask for anything, if I never put my needs out there or express displeasure, then maybe dad will like me. So all of a sudden now the child is learning that people will like me better if I don't have needs, if I make all the sacrifices. And what they're doing is setting up relationships based on shame, where if I stay inferior and let somebody else be superior, then the relationship will work. But it's really an adaptation based on shame and trauma, trying to get my needs met, trying to get love, trying to get acceptance. And what happens is the child basically then gets told that giving up your needs, making sacrifices, wow, you're being so loving. And often they get validated for it and they get lots of praise. Wow, you're such a good kid. And they think, wow, this is really getting my needs met. But they get to adult life and they realize there's an emptiness inside. They don't know who they are. They don't know how to take care of themselves. They don't know how to stand up for themselves. They let people walk all over them. They go into every relationship. And basically what it is if I give, will you give back? So it's now I give to get. It's not genuine love. It's love with an agenda. And so that sets up almost, all love in relationships is conditional. I got to perform in order to get my needs met. My needs will never get met just for me being me. Well, that's a distortion too, but that comes out of all of that stuff. And then if there's something wrong, so if dad's upset and angry or mom's depressed, what did I do wrong? I must have done something wrong. I should be able to fix this. I should be able to take care of dad's needs. So now what the child begins to do is, the way for me to feel good about myself is I have to keep everybody else happy. So I got to take care of everybody else's emotions. So then what that means is I have to have a radar that's super attuned to everybody else's mood, emotional state, what they think. So I know what dad's mood is the moment he walks in the door. I know what mom's mood is the moment I get home from school, because my radar is attuned to their central nervous system. And I quickly pick up on all the cues that as to where they're at. But what happens with that is I now know their moods. I don't know my own. I know what they feel. I don't know what I feel. I know what they think. I don't know what I think. So I'm more attuned to them than I am to myself. I don't have a clue what I'm feeling on any given day. But then I have to go beyond that. Not only do I have to keep them happy and take care of their emotions, so now I feel responsible for their emotions. I have to be happy all the time. Because if I'm sad, that might make them sad. So now I have to only have one emotion. So I got to shut down all the other emotions of my life, because that would be a burden to them. That might make them unhappy. So what you see is happening is the child is actually becoming less and less human. They're giving up their needs. They're giving up their emotions. They're attuned to everybody else, but not to themselves. So they're almost this people-pleasing little robot that is desperately pleasing everybody else, trying to get their own needs met. And it seems to work for a while, but they usually burn out or become very bitter, or they just start to medicate it with drugs, alcohol, activities, etc. So is that a good start?
Absolutely.
Oh, yes.
And I mean, there's so many parts of it, Tim, where literally, I think it was like 2-3 months ago, I had awareness where I woke up one morning and I'm journaling and doing all my morning routines, and Stephanie wakes up afterwards, and, you know, it's usually greeting in the morning. How are you? How did you sleep? Hugs and kisses and everything like that. And I recognized somehow, I don't even know how, because I have been doing it my whole life, but I recognized there was this subtle thing where I was waiting to see how she felt that day to decide what my day was going to look like and how I was going to proceed with my day. It was almost like I was in a really good mood. I was having a good morning. I had already had a cup of coffee, and I was like, I could hear her wake up and stir in the room, you know, in the bedroom. And when she came out, it dawned on me that suddenly I was putting everything that I was feeling, all the good moods that I was having, all the, you know, like literally a beautiful morning. And it's not like she came out angry or upset or anything like that. She didn't come storming in and yelling or anything. But I put all of those good feelings that I was having on hold, and then waited to see what she was going to respond with. How did she sleep? How was she feeling? Was she in a good mood? And then that was going to set the tone for my day. Right. And it was like this huge aha moment for me where I recognized, oh my goodness, like even at this phase of my life and at this phase of our relationship, I'm still doing that. And it was suddenly like, okay, we've got a big problem here, because we're actively working on healing all the time. We're totally connected to each other. Like we're aware of our, I guess in a sense, we're aware of our shit. But this was something that it was like, oh my gosh. So it became, we have to figure out what's going on. We have to figure out all the ways that codependency is still, I guess, showing up in our relationship. Or it's not even like still, it's just the foundation, I think, of our relationship is this codependent kind of like back and forth connection with one another. And so I'm really hoping too, Tim, that, because I know that this is a topic that gets a lot of, I think it's really misunderstood.
Yes.
And I think that it gets, like you said, shame gets, you know, misperceived in such a way. And I know that you talk about codependency in relationship to narcissism and like the co-narcissist. And when we started looking at that, it was one of those things that was really uncomfortable, right? We didn't like sitting in that space and kind of addressing it. But it really started to open up our eyes to the things that had been going on. It's almost like there had been a different version of our reality that had been playing out all along, where we had a story of when we met, we had a story of how we fell in love, we had a story of our relationship and our marriage and all these different things that had been going on. And then suddenly it was like, it's almost like a movie where suddenly it's like you go back in time and you see the truth of what was really happening. And so I'm hoping that we can get into that a little bit and do our best to kind of, because I don't want anybody to, like I said, I know it's a triggering topic for some people, but I think at the same time, it's important to understand where this stuff really but originates and where it comes from and kind of how it manifests.
Yep. So let me start back with the shame piece. So I'm not good enough. So usually a child will respond in one of two ways. So the one is they kind of just give into the shame messages and see themselves as inferior and kind of live out that script. But others try to compensate for it. I don't want to be inferior. I don't want to feel bad about myself all the time. So they overcompensate. And so they go to, I'm going to be better than everybody. And so that becomes their way of surviving. And so narcissism to me comes out of deep shame. It's a survival strategy to try and feel better about yourself. And so you base it not on your internal sense of who you are, but you now base it on your externals, your money, your possessions, your position, the trophy on your arm, all of those types of things that now determine your value and how important you are. So part of why it's important to start there for me is narcissism has really kind of been pathologized as you're just bad. And to me, it was a way of survival and coping for a child who was receiving severe trauma, which resulted in severe shame that I must be really terrible if I'm getting treated this bad. Now they had to compensate for it. So usually that comes out of, and this is so important to understand, is complex trauma within a home usually has one of the parents who is a narcissist, where they want everything to suit them. They want to be the boss. They want everybody to meet their needs, but they're not concerned in using their power and authority to meet the needs of others. They just want their own way. They want everything to suit them. And so the child is giving up their needs to accommodate a narcissist. Their child is trying to please a narcissist. And so a lot of the adaptations and the trauma come from a narcissist, but the child is learning to respond to a narcissist, but something else is also happening. They're developing a subconscious brain template that says, I'm developing skills to live with a narcissist, and this is now my normal, and this feels actually normal. This is my default. I'm good at this. I can survive here. And so what happens with that is they've got their own shame now because they've been feeling all of the, I'm not good enough. I have to give up my needs. I must be bad, not lovable, etc. So they go into relationships and they have this template of, as soon as they're with a narcissist, I feel attracted to that because it feels normal. It feels right. It feels good. And so without even realizing it, they're actually attracted to the very thing that wounded them. But narcissists typically, when you first get to know them, you don't see their dark side. You see only what they want you to see, which is their act, their mask, their performance. And it's very good. It's quite loving and kind in many ways. The dark side doesn't show up until later. And that's where the problems begin. And so co-narcissism and narcissism are two ends of the shame spectrum. One who's compensated by saying, I got to be better and superior. The other that says, co-narcissist, I am inferior. But what then happens to that is the co-narcissist now is, I need you to love me, to the narcissist. So I will enable you to never grow up, to never deal with your issues. I will take your pain away. I will please you. I will fix you just so that you love me. What's also important to understand with that is when you have deep complex trauma and deep shame, you also have a deep fear of abandonment. And so when a person who has received deep trauma, they feel all alone. They feel like they have been abandoned by the very people that should be connecting to them. And that is a terrible, terrible pain for any child to experience. And so now that their deepest fear is that I will never be abandoned again. So I will do whatever is necessary to get a few crumbs of love, even endure abuse, even endure not getting my needs met, just so I will never be abandoned. The narcissist and the co-narcissist both have a deep fear of abandonment. And so they are on their best behavior at first. They're kind of doing what they can to meet each other's needs, but they're not getting their own needs met. Their shame is preventing them from being authentic. Their shame is preventing them from actually receiving love. And so they're not satisfied. They end up with this emptiness, this dissatisfaction, this anger, this negativity that begins to express itself in the relationship, usually passive aggressive at first, but it starts to come out. But then when it starts to break down, they start to panic. Oh, this relationship's going to fall apart. I'll be abandoned. I can't have that. So let's get back on our best behavior. So the relationship starts to follow a cycle. There's a bit of a blow up. Then they're all afraid they're going to be abandoned. So everybody goes back to the honeymoon stage. Let's be on our best behavior. Let's all put our needs aside and just give, and do what the other person wants. But then the emptiness and frustration starts to build, and the tension and stress is building until there's an explosion again. And it just continues on this cycle. And so when you look at a codependent relationship, you could see it in the honeymoon stage and say, wow, that is one happy couple together. Or you could see it on the tension building stage and you go, oh, there's something seems to be there. I just can't put my finger on it. Or it could be at the explosion stage. And so, again, hopefully that gives you a little bit to go on.
Hey, everybody, we just wanted to take a minute and push pause real quick to thank you for being here and listening to the Steph and Craig Show. We know there's a lot of options out there when it comes to podcasts, and we are incredibly grateful that you chose us. The things that we have heard on podcasts have helped both of us in our healing journey. So we believe that they're incredibly powerful, and we have an important mission with this podcast that we need your help with. Head over to YouTube and search out The Steph and Craig Show. Be sure to click on the subscribe button, and don't forget about the little bell for those notifications so that you don't miss an episode. One other thing you can do is share it with somebody, whether it's this episode you're listening to right now or one of the other episodes that you've really enjoyed. We love you, we care about you, and we're on a mission to help you create better relationships and live your best life, because we believe we all do better when we heal together. Now let's get back to the show.
I've heard you say it before, and I think it's a great time to bring this up as we're going through this. When you're seeing yourself reflected, you're listening to this, and it feels like a lot. When you start to connect the dots, you're like, oh, that's me. That's our relationship. You're seeing this. This isn't when we're getting this information, it isn't to blame or shame, but it explains. It helps us give these tools, these insights of what's happening, how it's playing out, and why.
Exactly. And if I can just add a piece to that, Steph, what I would say is this. What comes out of shame is the emotions beyond the belief. So the belief is I'm not good enough. The emotions are I feel less than, but that then leads to I need to beat myself up. I need to put myself down. And if I fail, the way to change my behavior is not to be compassionate to myself and forgive myself. It's to be hard on myself. It's to tear myself down. And so a lot of people, when they begin to get these insights, they go to their go-to, which is, okay, let's start beating myself up. I'm a loser, and judge myself. And it's, no, please don't go there. There's no value in that. That's only going to add to more shame. It's going to feed the shame monster even more. You really need to go to this self-compassion and say, hey, now I'm finally understanding why I do what I do. And that doesn't mean I'm consigned to stay there forever. I can now begin to learn how to change that and to heal. And that brings in some hope for the first time. So yeah, that's such an important point. Thank you.
I wonder, Tim, if, because we try to avoid using definitives like every relationship or every person, or if you're, so I'm saying that this way, where it's like, if you're in a codependent relationship, then it's always going to be that narcissist and co-narcissist dynamic.
Right.
Would you say that, I mean, I don't want to say that that's every codependent relationship, but is it pretty common that those behaviors are going to be playing out in that way? Or are there other contributing factors and other kind of like dances that people will have in codependency that don't necessarily have that dynamic of the narcissist and the co-narcissist?
Yeah, I'm glad you raised it, because there's important qualifiers that need to be brought into this discussion, because it's not this black and white narcissist, co-narcissist. So a couple of the qualifiers is that in most relationships, each partner can be a co-narcissist and a narcissist. It depends on the day. It depends on what the triggers are. And so they tend to fluctuate. It's very rarely that you have a relationship where it's the same person is always the narcissist, the same person is always the co-narcissist. It can fluctuate.
Really?
Yes.
Like that alone is like blowing my mind right now to think about it that way, where it's okay. Say more. Sorry. I was like, hold on a minute.
So what can happen with the co-narcissist is they give, but they never receive back. And so they begin to get a huge resentment, and one day they explode. And if you don't smarten up, and if you don't start being considerate of me, then I'm leaving you. And they give and it's not an idle threat, but they give a threat. All of a sudden, the narcissist, they're panicking. I'm going to be abandoned here. I better smarten up. And so they don't truly change, but they go into crisis management. And now I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to meet your needs. The other piece with that is a narcissist, usually in the beginning, acts like a co-narcissist. So a narcissist in the beginning, they groom the other person by making them the center of the universe. So I'm going to listen to you. I'm going to mirror back to you what your interests are. I'm going to run and help you whenever you have a need. I'm going to give you gifts. The narcissist makes the other person the center of the universe until they're pretty sure they got the commitment from the other person, and then they switch. And all of a sudden they go back to being the narcissist, and the other person has to be the co-narcissist. So there's already, in the early days, a switch that happens once the commitment is kind of in place. But then that switch can happen back and forth. Is that making sense?
That makes total sense. And I think about that in relation to our relationship, where, I mean, it's hard, Tim, because truthfully, the things that you talk about and the way, what you've just described, we can relate to like 100%. Where when we first met, I was very much making Stephanie the center of my universe.
Right.
I was doing everything that I could to, I mean, like, this is the other thing that's kind of wonky for me when we talk about these things is you speak about it really clearly, like I mentioned at the beginning, which I think is really great, right? It's not clouded with any sort of like scientific talk or anything like that. You're just speaking about it really plainly. But it also makes it sound like like it's hard, Tim, because I wasn't doing these things in a conscious manner. I'm not sitting there being like, okay, I'm going to manipulate Stephanie and put her in this role. And then when I finally feel like, haha, I've got her and I've caught her in my trap now, I'm going to flip it around and make it this other thing, right?
So let me speak to that, Craig, because I think it's such an important piece. So two pieces. First of all is, for most people, codependency and shame is totally subconscious. So you're living out behaviors you're not even aware. You think your motives are this when you really don't know that the motivation is a deeper shame motivation. And so that's very important to understand. It's a subconscious thing that we tell ourselves often different messages about what's happening than what the truth really is about what's happening. But the second thing is, a shame-based person who's gone to the inferior, I'm less than, their only way of trying to, so they could meet somebody super healthy, and their only way of knowing how to make connection is I need to take care of your needs. I need to be there for you. I need to give of myself to help you. So they show up and give the person a coffee. They show up and can I help you with this? So their basic approach to relationships is I have to give in order to get. And so I have to put myself in a servant role in order to get any attraction. So they're not necessarily looking for a narcissist. They're just looking for a relationship. And it could be with a healthy person, and they try to push them to the narcissist position because that's how they know how to relate. And the other person, depending on how healthy they are, they can fall into that and go, oh, this feels good to get all this attention. And before you know it, the relationship's set up inferior superior, because the codependent needed to set the other person as superior in order to feel they're doing it right. And that happens with so many people without them even realizing that they're doing it. Because to them, they're just being a kind person when they meet the person. Can I get you a coffee? Can I do this for you? Can I help you? Oh, if you have a need, just phone me. I'll be glad to come and help you. And so they set up a relationship early on where they're serving, never asking, and no boundaries, never saying no. And it seems like the right thing to do, and it seems so loving and considerate, but they don't see how they've set up the old style of relationship. Does that help?
It does help. I mean, like I said, it helps to understand it, but it also like sucks to still sit in the space of it. I remember when we first met, she needed new tires on her vehicle, and it was winter time. And I snuck her car away, and I went and got tires for her, and surprised her with tires. And that to me was like just this act of love, because I loved her, and I like, we were in that honeymoon phase of our relationship where everything was going really well, and I just wanted to kind of surprise her with this really nice gift. And then you paint this other side. It's like the thing I was talking about earlier where we have another version, and I'm like, what part of me was trying to solidify the relationship in a sense? It's those parts of us that, like you said, it's the unconscious, it's the subconscious parts of us that are really in some ways acting, on our behalf. I don't know. Because I think about it too, Tim, where it's like, I can see how this relates to attachment. I can see how it relates to me wanting safety and security and trying to attach to somebody, right? Somebody that I love and somebody that I care about. But where do we find, I guess what I'm looking for is some clarity, and clarity is probably not the right word, right? But at what point do we, I guess what I'm asking is, when it comes to this type of behavior, is it something that, like, how is it? I'm getting caught up in my words here.
So
it seems like
can I take a crack at what I think you're getting at?
Yeah, that would be great.
What I emphasize to people all the time is that true love and codependency actually look the same on the surface.
Okay.
Initially, because you're giving. Both are giving. Both are making sacrifices. Both are concerned about the other person. Both are wanting to establish connection with the other person. So love and codependency on the surface initially look the same. And that's why people get confused. Am I codependent? Is this love? So the difference is two things. Number one, the motivation. So codependency, I'm giving so that you'll like me. I'm giving so that you will love me back and meet my needs. Love has an unconditional. I'm giving because you have a need and I want to meet it. If you give nothing back, that's fine. So there's a different motivation. But the second part to that where it begins to change is codependency over time. You begin to see it because the relationship is always out of balance. My needs always matter less than yours. Whereas with true love, your needs matter just as much as mine. It's always going to end up balanced. So I ask you how you're feeling this morning because I care, not because I now have to adjust my day and my moods to make sure you're happy, but that's a loving thing to do. And if you're having a bad day, I go, is there any way I can help? I don't then change my day and just run around trying to take care of you, because you got to fix that up yourself. That's your responsibility, but I can help some of it. So you begin to realize that on the surface, love and codependency look very much alike, but once you get deeper, you see different motivation. You see that the relationship is always out of balance as your needs versus their needs. And you begin to go, okay, that's not codependency isn't healthy love. It's distorted love. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I also wanted to swing back around too, because I forgot that I had another question for you. When we talk about narcissists, especially in society today and online and everything like that, it's almost like there's this big blanket label that everybody wants to throw on it to a narcissist, and then they cast them out there over, and it's like, don't touch them, stay away from them, they're evil people, they're the problem, don't ever victim blame somebody that's with a narcissist. And the way that you're describing the dance back and forth, where we'll each take turns kind of in that spectrum of going from co-narcissist to narcissist, is the way that you're speaking about it, are you speaking about it from that, like, this person has been, and I know it's so rare for somebody to get actually diagnosed as a narcissist through like the DSM and the whole 9 yards and everything like that? Or are you speaking about it, like, I guess, how are you speaking about it? Is it that super clear?
Yeah. So again, important qualifying point. So to me, there's two definitions that people really need to understand around narcissism. So there's the DSM, narcissistic personality disorder, and that's the person that's at the extreme end of the spectrum, and they're just there all the time. What I'm talking about is that, and so you end up with relationships like that are very codependent. But what I'm talking about is the majority of the times, it's narcissistic tendencies. And that's very different from a pure narcissist. So everybody coming out of complex trauma has narcissistic tendencies, because what did I have to do to survive? I had to put my needs ahead of yours. And so when my limbic brain is triggered by fear or danger, so the emotional survival part of my brain is triggered, I go into fight, flight, freeze, and it's all about me. It's all about surviving. And so when I'm in my limbic brain, act very narcissistic. And so to me, when you look at borderline personality disorder, basically it's very similar to a shame-based person who can act very loving and be very loving 95% of the time. But when their fear of abandonment or their shame gets triggered, they become a narcissist. All of a sudden, they're a different person. And it's like, whoa, where did that come from? And so that, to me, is kind of the important distinction, is everybody coming out of complex trauma has narcissistic tendencies, but they don't normally show up unless something has triggered fear or shame or stress in your brain that sends you into that survival response. And then the narcissistic tendencies come up. So that's where, when a person's in fear or anger or stress, all of a sudden they expect more of everybody else. You got to be perfect. You got to do this for me. What I want, don't argue with me, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, whoa, this is a narcissist just showed up here. Whereas that's the tendencies when their limbic brain is triggered.
Could you explain what borderline personality is for people that don't understand or haven't heard that term before?
Yeah, so borderline personality is another DSM term, and it's basically a person who, again, can be very normal in life, very calm, very cool, very rational, very reasonable, but then something triggers them and they become irrational. They become full of anger. They lash out. You can't reason with them, and they can do a lot of damage. And then afterwards, they're just very depressed. So it's a real roller coaster of, they go to extreme, lashing out high, anger, irrational, to very depressed, but then most of the time calm. And so again, it was like codependency, that they first kind of listed all the characteristics of this without really understanding, well, what's this about? And what they found is a person with deep shame and fear of abandonment is, as soon as you're about to expose my shame or you're about to abandon me, or I think you might abandon me. So that's anytime there's stress, anytime you make me feel stupid, anytime I don't feel that you're present or that you're emotionally not available to me, all of a sudden I'm triggered and I change and I lash out at you, and then we can't resolve it in conflict because I can't be reasoned with. I can only see it my way at that moment. And I'm right, you're wrong. I'm the victim, you're the bad guy, is what begins to happen. And so that is very common within codependency, is to have kind of mild to severe borderline type characteristics when people get triggered.
I like that you're framing this through kind of that lens of like, these are coping mechanisms that stem from that fight or flight response, where, because I know that that's helped me a lot to look at my childhood, to look at what life was really like. I think a lot of times, I know that we used to think this way. We talk to a lot of people where you have the common, understanding of like, yeah, my life wasn't that bad. I had a good childhood. Everything was okay for the most part. Maybe mom and dad, like my parents got divorced when I was 14, but the story that I had around that for a really long time was like, oh, that's not that big of a deal. It was actually better once they got divorced. But the more that I unpacked and really started to understand my childhood, it became really, really clear that it was complex. It was very much traumatic from the get-go. And so, oh my goodness, babe, I had a question in there. What was it? Tell me what the question was, baby. When it comes to, what do you find people, because like, how do we help people understand that? We'll post stuff online all the time, Tim, where people will be like, oh, here we go again. It's always about childhood. It's always about blaming your mom or your dad. It's always about this. And I'm like, yeah, it kind of is. Like, that's such a big component to the makeup of who we are, is that first, 7 or 8 years of life. And what are some things to help people see that maybe are resistant to kind of looking at it that way?
Well, if I can start with this, a lot of people, when they throw that argument out, oh, here we go again, it's always about childhood. Basically, what they've been exposed to is somebody that's always blaming somebody else for their problems. And they're eternally in victim status and refusing to change and always just blaming somebody. And they see through that and they go, that's not right. What we're doing is helping people understand how childhood shaped all of my coping, all of my thinking, my emotional world. And I need to understand that so I can change it. And the reality is that all of the coping skills that I learned as a child basically become programs in my subconscious brain. And they just operate on autopilot. Like I don't even have to think about it. They're just there, they're going, and different things trigger different programs. And then I just go into doing certain things without even understanding it. We can't change a subconscious program unless we bring it to the conscious mind and become aware of it and then consciously change it. And so the whole thing with all of this is, we're not talking about this to blame people. We're talking about this so we can change the programs. It's all up to leading to my responsibility now. I wasn't responsible for what happened to me or how I had to survive, but I'm responsible for what I do with it now so that I can get healthy. And so this isn't about blaming. This isn't about kind of abdicating personal responsibility today. It's all about personal responsibility today.
When I think about, so like we bring the subconscious to the conscious mind, right? I have awareness of, like, let's say I have awareness of these narcissistic tendencies that I have. And like, it's hard to sit in sometimes, and it's hard to own those experiences and those behaviors. But I'm also doing everything that I can for the most part to shift and change those behaviors. What's the process look like typically where somebody has, because that's the other thing too, is it's one of the fears that we have when we talk about some of these things is that it's never wanting to, like, it would be really easy to describe our relationship from this lens of Craig's the narcissist and Stephanie's the victim, where she was, had to put up with all the shit that I had, you know, because truthfully, we had a lot of struggle in the beginning of our relationship for the first probably 5, 6, 7 years. And the hard part of it is it's like the dance back and forth, I think, is the missing component, where Stephanie also played a role in the dynamic. She also had different things that she did. Do you know what I mean? But it's really difficult to talk through that when we have this label or this dynamic that is set up in culture where we don't want to, you know, it's like bypassing everybody's responsibility for what's going on in the relationship rather than just making it one person's fault, right? It's just that guy's fault, or it's her fault, or whatever the case may be. Or so what are some things that people can do to kind of help, I guess, take responsibility or ownership of that?
Yep. Such an important question. So the first thing to me is what happens in complex trauma when a child has constant pain and being hurt and needs not being met that they can't resolve. They're trying to resolve, but they can't fix the problem, is they're living with constant pain. And nobody wants to live with constant pain. So they either disconnect from their emotions and shove their emotions down and I'm not going to feel anymore, or they deny and they create a new story for their life that sounds happier. But the key thing is they're not looking at it accurately. They're minimizing, they're denying, they're rationalizing, but nobody's being accurate. Somebody's blaming, but nobody's owning. And so to begin with, you can't heal something unless you properly, accurately diagnose it. And so that's painful to do that, but that has to be the starting point. You got to validate the truth and get rid of the lies. The second piece to me, which is so important, is when I talk to couples with codependency issues, how I describe it to them is this. The guy comes into the relationship, so let's say it's a heterosexual. The guy comes in with his baggage. The woman comes in with her baggage. Then they live together in codependency and create a third set of baggage. What most do when they go into counseling is they want to fix the third set of baggage. But nobody wants to fix their own personal baggage.
Right.
So give me tools so we don't keep hurting each other. Well, I can give you lots of tools, but if you don't deal with your own personal baggage, you're going to keep hurting each other. There's no way to properly deal with the third set of baggage if you don't deal individually with your own personal baggage. The problem with that is, for most people, what you did with complex trauma as a child is you were attuned to the other person. Part of being attuned to the other person's needs and all of that is that now their emotions have more power over you than your own brain to manage your emotions. So if they're upset, you're upset. So you're reflecting, you're mirroring their emotional world. It's like you're regulated by them. So if they're calm, you're calm. But if they're dysregulated, you're dysregulated, because that's how tight the attunement is. So what happens when people start to say, okay, let's work on my own baggage, but they're living together, they're attuned to each other. Well, what's happening? The other person's having a bad day. Well, that's triggering me now. And what happens? I go back to old tools and create more of the third baggage. And so for many people, they can't work on themselves properly unless they somehow get some distance from the other person's stuff, because it just triggers them too much. And they're not strong enough to resist the trigger, to regulate themselves. And so that's the real tricky part for people, is how do you heal yourself when you're in a relationship? Do you need to take a break for a little while? Do you need to set some boundaries that enables you to not deal with certain things, talk about certain things, just work on your own stuff? Like, you have to figure out a way. And that's where most people really struggle. And it's a very practical consideration that I don't want to minimize, but it is so important to sort that out. Because if you don't start working on your own stuff and get healthier, you're never going to be able to have a healthier relationship. So with that, then, they have to start with healing that shame. They have to start with really beginning to understand not just kind of how their childhood affected them and what they believed about themselves, but all of their ways of coping with that. So self-awareness becomes a huge part of that. But then they have to begin to go, okay, now I understand what unhealthy looks like, but I don't have a clue what healthy looks like. So I have to begin to learn what healthy looks like. And I can't do that if I've never had role models for that. I need some healthier role models now. I need to be in a community that's kind of like a surrogate healthy family where I'm beginning to learn how to relate. I'm beginning to learn how to deal with problems other than the old tools. So there's a whole new set of hundreds and hundreds of tools that have to be gradually learned. And I think that's the key thing for people is you don't heal yourself and heal relationships by taking a 4-week course or a 12-week course. This is a very long process and you got to be super patient and you're going to need a lot of help.
We want to take a moment and really thank you for sharing your time with us. We know it's a valuable asset that you have, and we're honored that you're spending it with us. We both have experiences over the years where podcasts have helped us and influenced us greatly. That's why we're so passionate about podcasting, and we have a big mission with this show. We aim to reach over 1 million people, and we need your help. If you wouldn't mind doing these 3 things, it will help us grow and expand and reach more people. First off, subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. You can click the notification button as well so you don't miss an episode each time a new one is released. Secondly, if you would take a minute and leave us a review, that helps the podcast grow and expand as well. And last up, share it with somebody who you think might benefit, because we believe we all do better when we heal together. That's it. Thank you. We appreciate everything. Now back to the show.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I know that in the beginning, because we went through some couples therapy together, and then it was really apparent, I think, that it's exactly what you kind of described, where we had a ton of baggage from just our relationship, and we were trying to address it. We were trying to kind of go at it. And it was really apparent from early on. And we lucked out and we had some really good therapists, and they helped us both together, kind of like in conjunction with one another. But then also we were doing a lot of individual therapy, and it became apparent that we had, we might have had like 3, 4, 5, 6 big suitcases and some backpacks and things like that from our relationship. But we had like storage units of stuff that we had to get into from our past. And it really became almost like setting down the stuff that came from our relationship, from the baggage of our relationship, and really just going towards our own individual stuff. And it was hard. Exactly. It was one of those things that it felt like we were setting down our relationship. It felt like we were ending our relationship. It felt like we were breaking up. It continually was just like simultaneously kind of navigating those own little individual healing journeys together. But at the same time, it was like, I can't show up for you right now because exactly. I literally just don't have the capacity to. I'm so burned out from what I'm going through. I don't have the ability to. I want to go circle back a little bit, Tim, and talk about how addiction plays a role, not just in contributing to all of these things, but one of the things you talked earlier about the pattern and the cycle. That was one thing that we had a lot of awareness of after a few years of getting into stuff was, oh my gosh, we will very much go through the honeymoon phase. Will repeat that, everything's wonderful and amazing and we're having like the greatest sex ever. And then suddenly something will happen and we'll fight and we'll argue. And the next thing you know, it's like, fuck all this. And we're throwing out, and then we have to repair that with sex. And then we just repeat the process over and over and over again. And so I think that what we came to understand, or at least recognize in our own relationship, was there was parts of us too that, because we definitely have addiction, right? Substance and all sorts of different things as well, but we were addicted to that pattern and we were addicted to that cycle. And so if you could speak some more about how addiction kind of plays a role in regards to all of these dynamics.
Yep. So let me go right back to kind of how our brain works when there's danger. So the initial thing is brain secretes cortisol, which gets adrenaline going, and that gives you the energy to fight or flight. And it's designed to be a short-term fix where you get out of the danger and then the cortisol stops and you relax and you go back to your normal balance in your central nervous system. The problem is complex trauma for a child is they get cortisol and they get really angry and afraid and they want to fight or flight, but they're too little to run away and they're too little to fight. So the brain is going, well, that option didn't work. So now what do I do? So they go to the third option, which is freeze. And that's where the brain now does a different chemical. The brain releases actual natural opioids in the brain. And so fight or flight cortisol basically is I'm going to escape into my outside world. I'm going to go external solution. But if that's not working, what opioids basically do is I'm going to retreat into an internal world that I create that's safe for myself. That's dissociation, basically. But to take it further, cortisol, it puts blood into the extremities and the muscles in the extremities so you can run faster, etc. Puts extra sugar into the blood. Opioids, they bring all the blood from the extremities right around the heart. And basically it is saying, let's get prepared to get hurt and cut so that we don't bleed as much and so we don't feel pain. So opioids deaden the pain and they prepare you to get cut. And so what happens then for people is, depending on kind of the extremity of the trauma, some today still go to the fight flight, but most with complex trauma have gone to the dissociation. They've gone to the opioid version. But somewhere in the right in the middle crossover, some don't go to the extreme opioids. They go to, I just need a distraction. Let's keep busy. Let's go. So that's their way of dissociation with cortisol. Go, distraction. And so that's where you can get into the process addictions. So let's gamble. Let's do risky behaviors. Let's do kind of extreme kind of sexual behaviors, acting out. Let's eat food. Let's exercise, go. But I just have to stay busy all the time. Let's become a workaholic because our society validates that. So that's that. But then you go
That's totally me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then and those people then get attracted to the stimulant drugs, so crack and meth, because that keeps the energy and the power and the good feelings going. But for many, they go to the opioid end of the drug thing, and so that's shut down. Let's isolate. Let's become invisible. Let's go into a fantasy world. Let's split off parts of myself so that I don't feel them or even know they're there. So all of that begins to happen. I can't stay present in the present because it's too painful. So let's go somewhere else that's not painful, is what is there. Then when they find drugs, they go, like opioid drugs, I just found the perfect solution. Now I can go to this place. So to me, what's important to understand about the chemical drugs is, so we got kind of 4 good feel chemicals that happen in the brain. So we got dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphins. So dopamine is the pleasure. Serotonin is I feel close and connected to people socially. Oxytocin is I feel in love. And endorphins is kind of the exercise, pleasure, thrill of that. All of those were designed to be released when a child connects with a safe person at an intimate level. That releases oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin. All of those are designed for connection. What happens if a child can't connect in complex trauma? They don't get any of those chemicals. Rather, they get cortisol or opioids. But cortisol and opioids create many of the feelings of oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine. So if you look at drugs, they're dopamine, that's your crack and meth. They've got they've got serotonin, that's your MDMA stuff. All of those things are part of that. And so they release the chemicals that were designed to be released by connection. Problem is they don't last. They're not real, but yet they feel finally so good. And that's why so many people, the first time they actually use, they feel like they're wrapped in a warm blanket. They even have an orgasm that just feels so good. All of those chemicals are finally in the brain. The problem is, the more you use the drugs, the more the brain tolerates that. And so you get less and less delivered until you're not getting any of the chemicals anymore. You're just using the drugs so you don't go to even worse negative emotions. You're trying to cope, you're trying to get through a day, but you've given up getting any of the 4 good chemicals anymore. Another piece around that is cutting releases natural opioids. So that's why when people cut, it actually feels good, because it releases opioids in the body and it takes the pain away, the emotional pain away. And so that becomes an addiction. So all of those addiction things are actually solutions to not having any positive chemicals in my brain and not connecting, because it makes me feel it. So it can be a chemical or a process that gives that release. But again, your needs aren't being met still. And so there's still going to be a deep emptiness afterwards. There's still going to be a deep pain afterwards, which means I got to use more. I got to keep doing it more often. And then it delivers less and less.
It almost seems like damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yeah.
Because I'm sitting here thinking about, neither one of us have ever had, an intense addiction to illegal drugs or anything like that. But we both have had our fair share. I mean, we both smoked for years and years and years. We both have used alcohol off and on. I guess I should. That's the other big thing I've been working on, Tim, is like not referring to us or we when I speak. That's like my major.
My story is a little different,
right? But I stopped doing a lot of these. We stopped smoking. I stopped smoking years ago, but I find that trying to get off of those other, trying to get off adrenaline, trying to get off of those other chemicals that I can almost feel at times get activated in my body. It's a lot of work. Like it seems almost impossible at times to try to get off of something that my body is naturally producing.
Yeah. So if I can speak to that, kind of 2 important things. A lot of people, when they think of addiction, they just think in terms of chemicals. So alcohol, drugs, and they go, that started at age 13, 17, whatever. And that's where they go, that's my addiction problems began. But go back, because all people started with process addictions. So a child, let's say, so we got physical needs, emotional needs, intellectual needs, relational needs, spiritual needs, that if one of those isn't met, we feel an emptiness. We feel something's missing, or we feel kind of a thirst in that area. And so we try to get it resolved. We eat food, we drink water, etc. And we can resolve it, and that thirst goes away because the need's been met. But in complex trauma, the child's not being accepted, the child's not being listened to, the child's not being valued, the child's not being validated, the child's not being comforted. So all kinds of emotional needs aren't being met. Nobody's attaching to them. They can't be authentic. And so they've got all of this emptiness inside and pain inside and a thirst inside that they try to resolve, but they can't. But then they go to grandma's, and grandma gives them chocolate ice cream. And that releases chemicals in the brain that feels like those needs have finally been met. And so the brain gets wires crossed. So if I'm feeling sad, the brain doesn't go, I need to be comforted by a safe person. The brain goes, I need chocolate ice cream. And so what happens for people with drug and alcohol addictions is they give up the drug and alcohol, and all of a sudden they find out they're putting on weight because they've gone back to an earlier addiction. They've gone back to eating as their first form of comfort, or they go back to, so what a child does is finds ways to self-soothe. And so we need parents, when we have a need and we're dysregulated because of that need, we have a thirst to meet that need. We need a parent who's regulated to come in and meet the need and to soothe us. And that means they got to connect with us and be safe. But if I don't have that, then I don't get soothed, I don't get regulated. my need doesn't get met, I stay dysregulated, and I don't like that. So I have to find ways to self-soothe. And so a child begins to rock. A child they find masturbation and they begin to masturbate. They find food, they begin to eat. They find exercise and playing sports, and that seems to help. So they find all kinds of different self-soothing techniques, which most of them are all good things, but actually now they're misusing them beyond their original purpose. But it settles them down for a little bit, but it actually makes things worse in the end. It's settling their limbic brain down, but there's going to be consequences down the road that they don't even see at that point. And so what's really happening for people is go back to look at their earliest self-soothing things, because that then becomes your default in your brain as to where it's going to want to go to the minute I'm feeling stressed, the minute I'm feeling upset. I want to go back to what soothed me. So if I haven't learned new healthy tools to soothe in healthy ways, I will go back to the earliest tools that I developed for self-soothing.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. I know that. See, I caught it that time. I was going to say, I know but one of my earliest coping mechanisms is food. It's still we came home last night and we had been having some difficult conversations, and I was overwhelmed by the time we got home. And it was like the only thing I could think about was getting the little ice cream bar out of the fridge. And it was even like 9:00 at night. And I'm like, there's a conscious part of my brain that's like, seriously, dude, like you're going to eat the ice cream right now? And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to eat the ice cream right now. And so I know that that's a really early one for me. What were you going to say, babe? Were you going to say something?
I was sitting here, like I caught myself, I'm rocking. As you say, some of us rock. And I was like, okay, hold on. There is like so much. There's so many things that I want to try to bring up in this space, but my brain will just jumble them all up into like a cyclone of forgetfulness. But it's really hitting the dissociation, the freeze being like an opioid. And that's scary. I go to the freeze a lot, but I hate it. Like I get stuck there and I feel trapped. I feel like that's when everything bad is going to happen. And so as soon as I can start that cortisol, as soon as I can start, whether it's eating, whether it's micromanaging or obsessing about reorganizing the dishes or something, as soon as I can get out of that, I call it my momentum.
Exactly.
As soon as I can get active, I'm like, oh, I'm okay. As soon as I don't have to think, feel, I can just move, then I'm safe. I like to be awake and on and going, but I can't sustain that. And then I crash and feel vulnerable and terrified. It's the cycle.
Yeah. So if I can add one more piece, and it ties in with codependency. So what happens to a child who's had to freeze because they can't fight or flight, but the people that mom and dad who aren't meeting their needs, who are hurting them, neglecting or abusing them, they still need them to meet their needs. So they go to the fourth F, which is fawning. So I will be what you want me to be. I will give up all my rights and all my needs and please you constantly. I'll never say no. I'll become a people pleaser just so that you will let me survive. And so that sets a person up for codependency. So many people who end up in codependency are fawners. That's how they've had to survive as a child. And so that's now their go-to for surviving. Whereas some, like you talked about, Steph, would be, okay, I'm feeling myself freezing. I have to get active, so I need a shot of cortisol. And so you go to extreme activity. So what for many people with fawning is opioids are happening, but you try to get a bit of cortisol happening so that you can become attuned again to somebody else. So you can get into action again. And that helps you with your own anxiety. That helps you with your own internal feelings. Because I feel in control again. I feel I can handle things again. And so again, it's trying to adapt to handle the extreme freeze feeling.
Yeah. I see that completely. I see too that if I feel like I am doing enough, it's I think going back to like I'm loved. Like if I can be either doing what you want or doing enough activity, then I've earned value, I've earned worth, and I'm safe now because you're not going to leave, whether it's being good enough myself or being what you need. And it's just that, like, I can't believe we're still in this cycle after all these years of work. I'm like, how does this still coming up? And here it
So
is.
if I can add one more piece that I think is important. So when I'm helping people with shame, codependency stuff, they need to understand their childhood, number one. But secondly, they need to understand family dynamics. And thirdly, culture. And so there's two sets of a set of family dynamics and a cultural element that actually support codependency. And it's important to understand that. So for a lot of families and cultures that are either shame-based or certain types of religion, basically codependency was seen as love and humility was seen as shame. So if you stood up for yourself, you're being proud. If you validated yourself, you're being proud. You can't have a big head, so we got to keep putting you down so that you stay humble. So shame became equated with humility. And if you give all your needs away and sacrifice, wow, you're the most loving person in the world. And so cultures, shame-based cultures and certain religions actually teach codependency, but call it love, teach humility, or teach shame, but call it humility. And so what that does is it trains a little child's conscience that now if I stand up for myself, I'm being selfish. I am being proud. If I am not giving, I'm lazy. I'm not being loving. So now you have a ton of false guilt on top of everything else because you were trained with the wrong definition of love and the wrong definition of humility. And so part of the healing journey for people is being able to not just deconstruct their childhood, but to deconstruct their family belief systems and their cultural belief systems to begin to identify how their conscience was mistrained so that now they feel false guilt when they shouldn't feel guilt at all. Does that make sense?
I think it makes total sense. And again, it almost feels like we're screwed, Tim, because I feel like that's what, the Western society culture, I feel like we've talked about this a lot too, where it's like we have these early programs because we looked at things through this lens of like Disney movies, where my favorite Disney movie was Beauty and the Beast. And the Beast is, but seeing the dynamic of love play out in relationships on film and on TV, they're really, really toxic, terrible relationships that we're seeing portrayed. And yet it's love, and yet it's ideal, and yet it's the thing that we're all using to, and so it's like, how do we unpack it? Literally, it just feels like there's too much to process. We're bringing awareness to too many things to try to fix and change. And now I just want ice cream. And so.
Yeah. And that's where I say to people, that's why we started our online lift program. And so it's 75 modules, which you can do it every day for 15 weeks, or you can do it twice a week or 3 times a week, and it goes longer. But anyways, it's realizing there's so much to unpack that you have to go through a systematic, careful process in doing that. To try to just do it on your own, it gets too overwhelming, or you miss kind of the right sequence of unpacking it, and you get the cart before the horse, and then you get all confused because this isn't working. And so it's really realizing we need help to unpack this properly. And we're not just unpacking it, but we have to learn what healthy is in the process and tools to how to get healthy as part of that process as well. And it's got to be a gradual journey that somebody kind of walks with me on if I'm going to do it well. And so what I see with a lot of people is they can get a lot of help by watching my videos or reading books, or etc. But typically they grow to a certain point and then they stop. And it's like they can't seem to get beyond that point. And it's what I've seen is because they need somebody with more experience to come in and point out what they can't see yet. And that's just the reality, that we still have blind spots in our own healing journey, and we need help from compassionate people with wisdom and insight. So,
what are some things that you find people get stuck on? Like some common things that people, maybe are on the path and they've been doing some work, and maybe they, have a couple of years of sobriety under their belts, but what are some common things that people get stuck up on, get held up on?
I would say, to me, initially in the beginning of recovery, a lot of your recovery is through learning and growing self-awareness. So it's information driven, and it's overwhelming in a sense, but it's also exciting in a sense. Look what I'm learning. I'm putting words finally to stuff. I'm making sense out of stuff. I'm seeing what the tool should be. I'm changing, and a lot of good growth can come out of that. But then you reach a point where you still got to engage in life, and you still got to have relationships. And then what begins to happen is most of the new growth is not initiated by learning material, it's learning by being triggered. And that's not a fun part of growth, because it always starts with pain. It always starts with, oh, I went back to old tools. I'm regressing. I can't do this right. Have I learned anything? But if you don't beat yourself up, if you go to curiosity and self-compassion, you can go, okay, what's going on here? And it's realizing that the hardest often part of growth is the ongoing triggers, because they take you immediately to your limbic brain, to pain. And when we go to our limbic brain, we see the world again through the eyes of that 5-year-old. And it's quite distorted. And our reasoning is very much driven by what we're feeling, not by the facts. So it's emotional reasoning. And so we get quite distorted in our thinking. And that's where we can spiral downhill in a hurry if we don't have somebody to help us. And so what I would say with many people is, during the learning part of recovery, they form good connections. And then they get to a point where they go, okay, I've taken the course, I've learned, I'm ready to go off on my own. And they break the connections and they try to go solo. Then they get triggered and they start spiraling, and they don't know how to stop the spiral. And for most of them, within 2 or 3 days, they start to lose their way because they don't know how to get out of this. And so you got to maintain the connections with at least one person who can help you during the triggers. And what people find is, if every trigger, if you don't beat yourself up for it, but you see it as a chance to learn and grow some more, you do learn and grow. And then the triggers become less frequent, they become less intense, because every trigger leads to greater healing, to greater tools. But those triggers are brutal, because when your limbic brain is triggered, you go from 0 to 100 in a nanosecond, and you're trying to stop going to old tools in a nanosecond. With cortisol pumping in your brain, which is turbocharging everything, how do you stop a moving train when it's leaving the station? Like, it's just, whoa, what do you do? And that becomes the most frustrating, difficult part for people, and I think in recovery.
How are you keeping these healthy connections without turning them into now back into an old pattern? You have this healthy connection, but slowly you start to integrate, and now it's the same thing you've recreated.
Exactly. And that's the danger with many people, is they make connections, but they don't deal enough with their own shame stuff yet. And so pretty soon they're back to the old style of relationship in that connection. And so that's where, to me, you need connections with kind of other people on the journey who you're learning together, and there's going to be some healthier versus unhealthier relationships that develop. But you also need a mentor that is going to set healthy boundaries. And so what I tell clients all the time is, if I get to meet you, I've done this long enough that I can immediately feel the pull that you're placing on me, trying to pull me into a certain style of relating to you. And I can go, if I give into that pull, we're going to set up an unhealthy relationship. So I have to set boundaries right up front about what healthy looks like. But the other person is not going to like those boundaries because for them that's scary. But I have to take the lead, and I need, so somebody working through their codependency, they need to find a healthy person who's going to maintain and enforce healthy boundaries while they adjust and heal and learn until those new boundaries become their default. And that's where so many people don't have that. And so they gradually slide back to their old defaults, and they've done a lot of good work, but they end up back where they started.
I know we've been talking a lot about this through the lens of like, intimate relationships with your partner and things like that. But I know from my own experience that these codependent dynamics have played out in all of my relationships with friends, with parents, with our children. If you could speak about how that's the case, where it's these things aren't just with your primary partner, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, so I emphasize to people is that for most kids growing up in complex trauma, so they could become codependent by needing to survive. So life was dangerous, so they had to give up their needs, adapt, and all of the stuff we talked about. But they also could have been trained to be codependent by parents who, based on their culture, children should be seen, not heard. Children should always obey and just get over stuff, all of those kind of things, be happy all the time. And so they are actually being trained to be codependent by well-meaning parents. And those dynamics have been in the family for years and years, and it's part of the culture even. And so what begins to happen in recovery is your parents still want to relate to you the same way, that you have to phone me every day. You have to tell me everything all the time. You can't set boundaries with me because that would be disrespectful. You can't say no to me. That would be disrespectful. You can't challenge me and call me on my stuff. That would be, so there's all kinds of different things that are part of that kind of dynamics within the family that the child has just been trained in. It's like the water they swim in. They don't even know it's there till they try to change it. And all of a sudden the family's mad at them. You're being a rebel. You're not cooperating with the program. You're not conforming. So those kind of families, it's all about conformity. But what's really happening is you're asked to conform to what is unhealthy. And as soon as you try to make it healthy, you're now the bad guy. You're now the rebel. And they're going to use all kinds of tactics to pull you back into conforming. So they're going to lay guilt on you. They're going to threaten you. They're going to get angry at you. They're going to have your aunt call you and say, what are you doing to this family? Your mom can't sleep, blah, blah, blah. So there's all kinds of different things that they will do. And so what I want people to realize is that often breaking the codependency with your parents is harder than breaking it with your partner because it's been going on for years. But then what happens is that was your parenting template. You grew up that's how families operate. And so you just start reproducing it with your kids, that you should be seen and not heard. You should be happy all the time. Quit crying so much. If you want something to cry about, I'll give you something to cry about, blah. All those kind of things begin to happen. And all of a sudden we're training our children to be codependent. And it's like, whoa, where did that come from? Well, we didn't even know it. We were wanting the best for our kids. We just fall into the template we were raised with. And so to me, again, you have to be able to deconstruct the family dynamic stuff and realize there's probably 80% of that was really healthy, but there's some unhealthy stuff there that I'm going to need to look at and change so I don't pass it on to my kids. And so that's why we say complex trauma is the only type of trauma typically that becomes generational trauma. You just pass it on without even realizing it, thinking you're doing the best you can, given what you were taught and the tools you were given. And so you pass on all the stuff to your children.
Tim, I think we've done a really beautiful job. You've done a really beautiful job of helping us understand so many different things. And I know the people listening as well. But earlier on, you were talking about how, you're unlearning these things. And the challenging part is that you don't have healthy examples to draw from, especially if it is, a generational thing where you grew up in this. I know that I did, and I can say I know Stephanie did as well. But maybe if you wouldn't mind, take a moment and just kind of paint the real idealistic picture of what a healthy interdependent relationship between two people would kind of look like.
Right.
Because I know that everybody, we're always kind of striving to work towards it. And I think sometimes we glimpse it. And then 2 hours later, we're like, oh, nope, we're still stuck in codependency, right? What does a real idealistic kind of view of what a relationship not necessarily should be, but can be?
Right. So a bunch of different ways to come at this, but start with this. So basically it's putting words to what does love look like? And so we all have these physical, emotional, relational, intellectual, spiritual needs. And so a relationship is, or a healthy life is, where those 12 needs are being met. What happens though is I can't meet all of my 12 needs on my own. There's some needs that I need others to help me meet. But 95% I can learn, and I need to learn how to meet them on my own and have a relationship with myself and all of that. But I do need relationships to help meet some of the needs. So I do need connection. I do need comfort, and I do need encouragement, and all of those things I need somebody else for. And so part of the challenge to me with all of this is a relationship is, I got to start with a relationship with myself before I can ever have a healthy relationship with anybody else. So I have to learn to take care of my needs, to be aware of my needs. I have to learn to be present to myself. All of that becomes the starting point. Then when I get into a relationship, there's going to be, the basis is this: your needs matter just as much as mine, 50-50. So over time, there's going to be days I sacrifice, there's going to be days you sacrifice, but over time, it's going to work out to about 50-50 sacrifice, give and take. It's not going to be a lopsided thing where you get your way 90% of the time and I give in 90% of the time. It's going to be a 50-50 imbalance is what so that means I have to talk about my needs. That means I have to be vulnerable. That means I have to attach and truly connect with that authentic, vulnerable me. Well, that's never happened before in complex trauma. So you're learning a whole new set of connection. But then I have to learn to be present to you and attuned to your needs. And then when I see you're having a bad day or you're struggling, then it's like, what's their part? What's my part? Do I run in and do it all for them? Or do I help a little bit, but they got to do most of it? And so we got to talk about that. We got to figure that out. So that's now communication. That's potential conflict. Oh, that's scary. That's not cut and dry. Is this 73% or 68%? I don't know. It's somewhere in the middle there. How do we figure that out? So there's a whole lot of learning about how to meet each other's needs and what's your part and what's my part. What are you responsible for? What am I responsible for? But the bottom line is your needs matter just as much as mine. And so we have to be all about learning to meet our own needs, but then where we help each other with our needs.
Tim, we can't thank you enough. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you. I know that you've got a ton of videos on your YouTube channel that talk about all of these topics and more. Your website, it's timfletcher.ca. Is that right?
Yes.
Is there anything else that you'd like to throw out or mention before we wrap up?
No, that's it. Like I mentioned, we do have an online course that people can take, and we now have some self-study courses that people can take, just because we realize this is a very complex journey that takes a lot of time and needs a lot of support. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that relationships, for me personally, I think it's part of I think it's what this whole thing is all about, meaning life. I think we're here to have these connections. I think we're here to connect with other people, to experience love, to have love, all of these kind of things. And it's kind of the hardest thing to do, right? I mean, it's incredibly challenging, and we've highlighted over the last hour and a half of exactly why that is the case. But thank you again, Tim. We can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We wrap every episode with a fun little tagline. It's expect the best and plan for the greatest.
Very good. Well,
so we'll see everybody on the next. Yeah, nice to meet you too as well, Tim. Thank you. And we'll see everybody next time.
Wait and see, you and me, we were meant to be.
We want to make something perfectly clear. This podcast is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only. It's not intended to be used as a substitute for professional advice. We're sharing with you our own personal insights and experiences, things that we have found to be helpful and healing on our journey. But we are not licensed therapists. If you need help, it's important to seek out a qualified professional. Remember, we believe we all do better when we heal together. See you soon.